We are very lucky to have, sadly not with us in person, but on screen, Vivek Ramaswamy, the author of Woke Inc., one of the books that actually kicked off this conversation about what is wrong with the modern company. He's also the founder of asset manager Strive and now a presidential candidate. So do we have Vivek? We do. Hello, Vivek. Welcome.
Thank you for the warm welcome, and I appreciate the opportunity to join you all this way. I quite look forward to being there in London in person, but at this particular moment I'm speaking to you from the back of a bus in rural northwest Iowa, as would be predictable on the journey that I'm on right now. But I am looking forward to picking up on the conversation where Paul Marshall just left off, to dive deeper into the nature of this cancer and then how we overcome it. So part of the reason why, and Paul began to touch on this, is the failure to allow creative destruction to have seen its own course. I'll begin this story with a reminder of what one of the origins of the spread of woke capitalism really was. It's not the entire story, but it's a forgotten story. It was actually the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, which many of you may well remember. I remember it well because I got my first job in the fall of 2007 in New York City at a hedge fund. Pretty interesting time to get a first job in finance. What happened in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis was we saw the beginnings of what would have been a system of creative destruction. However, the government, and I think a bureaucracy within that government, intervened to prevent that creative destruction from happening, which gave fuel, moral justification of the left to then say we're going to occupy Wall Street. You might remember that movement that said they were going to redistribute money from those wealthy corporate fat cats and give it to poor people if the whole thing were nationalized in a way that stopped creative destruction from playing out in the first place. Well, what happened then was, and this was really part of the origin story of where woke capitalism was born, Wall Street actually had a clever choice to make, to say that, you know what, we will adopt certain of the norms of that left-wing backlash. Climatism, COVIDism today, but wokeism, racial wokeism, whatever the idea is, token minorities on boards, musing about the racially disparate impact of climate change after flying on that private jet to Davos. We will do these things as financial institutions. We will implement agendas through the back door that government couldn't quite implement through the front door, such cultural agendas. But we won't do it for free. We effectively expect the Occupy Wall Street movement to go away. And it did. And it turns out that other institutions in corporate life began to do the same thing. Silicon Valley, around the same time, was facing calls for breaking up big tech that used to come from the prior left. That's not a conservative call back then. It was a left-wing call. But Silicon Valley was able to make a similar move, saying that we will censor hate speech and misinformation through the back door, as governments, at least in the United States, could not do. But we didn't do it for free. We expected that the new left looked the other way when it came to leaving Silicon Valley's monopoly power intact. So I do think that that theme that Paul artfully drew on, the theme of creative destruction, it was in some ways the bureaucratic prevention of the creative destruction process that gave the intellectual, at least appearance of coherence, to allow woke capitalism to spread as much as it did. Well, that was the beginning of when the ESG cancer really began to take off. The use of market actors, the use of capital, indeed in a certain sense capitalism itself, to accomplish through the back door what government could not itself accomplish through the front door under, in the U.S., the constitutional process. Now, it's worth understanding two different criticisms of what exactly is going on here. The traditional criticism, a Friedmanite criticism, which I share, is that this will lead companies to be less efficient, less prosperous over the long run, if they're focused on orthogonal social agendas, in addition to their core agendas of delivering products and services for customers and making a profit doing so, maximizing shareholder value. Milton Friedman's concern, which probably many of us share, which I share as well, is that companies will be less effective in delivering prosperity to society if they're diluted in their core focus from their core mission. I think there's an even deeper concern, however, which runs in the other direction, which is that it's not only that it sucks the lifeblood out of capitalism, And I do think that this partly accounts for why American and U.S. stock returns outpaced that of Europe for the latter part of the 20th century, is that the U.S. had a sole vision, certainly in the post-1970 era, of maximizing shareholder value as the corporate purpose, when European companies generally had multiple purposes that were tethered to a multi-stakeholder vision of the corporation. But that wasn't the only problem, not just the economic deficit, but the reverse, that it sucks the lifeblood out of a constitutional republic where citizens do not decide any longer what the right way is to settle a difference on climate change or racial injustice. But that difference and that responsibility is delegated to a small group of corporatocratic autocrats in the back of corporate boardrooms. And so it is equally a threat, not just to capitalism, but also a threat to democratic self-governance to decide that it is a small group of market actors that have unique responsibility to decide again through the back door what citizens could not decide anymore through the front door in a republic. And so that brings us to the question of what to do about it. I've been asked to talk to you about good governance in the side of capital markets, and so I'll constrain my comments to that scope for today, although I'll be heading right from this speech to a grassroots audience in Iowa, which I explain the threats to a constitutional republic. Here's what we can do about it in the context of corporate boardrooms. The sole purpose of a corporation should be to maximize value for its shareholders by focusing on delivering its products and services to its customers. Period. Now, the question is this the moral purpose of a corporation? Yes, it is. And this is bringing back Milton Friedman's doctrine. But to answer the question of social responsibility, to say that part of corporate social responsibility is to exercise that level of restraint itself. That level of restraint is not just about maximizing the size of the pie for shareholders, but it is also about exhibiting corporate respect for the body politic itself. Part of the belief that limited liability, the special privileges granted to corporate shareholders to say that they can't be sued, that society gives them that blanket of immunity, the return that you give back to society is to stay out of the rest of society's affairs. Which brings us to what we think of now as good governance in the corporate boardroom. The ultimate irony is actually in the ESG movement that Paul Marshall eloquently spoke about, is that the failure of governance was rooted in the premise of good governance that they claim was missing in the first place. Disentangling the E and the S from the G is a core part of calling that farce for what it is. It's like an ungrammatical amalgamation of three different letters of the alphabet that really have nothing to do with one another. But not only do they have nothing to do with one another, they're actually in tension with one another. Good governance means the corporation is true to its own purpose, its own unique purpose. Different corporations may have a different mission, but part of that is sticking to the mission of that corporation without diluting that mission with environmental or social goals that are orthogonal to its purpose. So the ultimate farce at the heart of the ESG game is really the illusion that in the name of good governance, we've actually drained the lifeblood out of what governance means by commingling orthogonal environmental and social objectives in the game. The objection you'll traditionally hear is that, and it's a tough one to overcome, is that the corporate boards will today tell you that it's the market actors that are telling them to do this. So if Paul Marshall and I are saying that corporations should focus on maximizing shareholder value as their objective, well, isn't that in tension with the fact that many shareholders themselves are actually the ones who are demanding that corporations pursue these social and orthogonal objectives? On face value it is, but the real issue today is the so-called shareholders are not the actual owners of capital in those boardrooms. And that's the key way where we wake up to the unique challenge of 2023, which were different than that of Milton Friedman when he wrote nearly 40 years ago, when he wrote 50 years ago, his famous essay about the moral purpose of the corporation. Back then, the question was the separation of ownership and control. The idea that the people who control the corporation, the management, may not be aligned with the shareholders. But today, the real question is not the separation of control from ownership. It's the separation of ownership from ownership. When the people who proclaim to be the shareholders in those corporate boardrooms, the very people who now are not the victims but the perpetrators of environmental and social agendas permeating the boardrooms. The purported shareholders were not the actual shareholders, the actual owners of capital. And that, in a nutshell, is the essence of the BlackRock problem. Now, the way we deal with that is to make sure that the voices that are heard in those corporate boardrooms are indeed the voices of the owners of capital themselves. Where does this problem trace back to? None other than not the invisible hand of the market, but the invisible hand of government itself. And I will leave this thought with you all in closing. I've been there on the other side of this before. I know it's a bit challenging to be held captive to a man speaking to you via a screen who can't hear an audience response to take cues on when it's time to wrap up. So I'll say that I will be sympathetic to you, having been on the other side of that before, but I will say this in closing. Here's the dirty little secret. What is causing those pro-ESG market actors like BlackRock to behave the way they are is none other than actually the invisible hand of government itself. Government actors like pension funds from states in the U.S. like California and New York, to pension funds of Western European countries or European pension funds, that themselves are trying to accomplish a political agenda by telling the BlackRocks and the Vanguards of the world that they don't get access to manage that pension fund money unless they adopt proxy voting and shareholder engagement guidelines that speak for the political objectives that those state actors couldn't achieve through the front door. That is why they're using everybody's money, including those of ordinary citizens, to tell corporate boards like Apple and Chevron and Exxon that they have to adopt these racial and climate policies. It's because the people whose money they manage, at least the largest of those actors, are really government actors that are themselves abusing those pension fund holders, which in turn leads back to a much more familiar problem. The bureaucracy of governments that fail the citizens or the pensioners who they're supposed to represent. So in many ways, this is hopefully an uplifting story that the culprit at the end of the day in this otherwise complex cancer is a familiar culprit. It's a culprit of bureaucrats represented in government that are no longer responsive to the interests of the citizens they were supposed to represent. But in the modern moment, it has taken the avatar of this new woke industrial complex where they're deputizing these private actors in the name of capitalism to carry out fundamentally anti-capitalistic objectives. And once you see that for what it is, the solutions then become that much clearer, ultimately from rescinding things like pro-ESG protective provisions, like we have in the United States and in Western Europe, all the way to disentangling public pension funds abusing these market actors to get them to adopt agendas that they couldn't through the front door. So with that said, I hope that foregrounds the panel discussion that you're about to have over there. And I will say this in closing, that from a U.S. perspective, we live in a 1776 moment, but a 1776 moment that I hope rings true around the world, where citizens of democracies and citizens of self-governing nations have an opportunity to say hell no to these agendas. That we, the people, will once again be the ones who decide the differences on climate change policies to racial injustice. That we, the people, will restore in our constitutional republics, in our self-governing models, in our nations around the world. We, the citizens, will take back control from this merger of state power and corporate power that together is doing what neither one could do on its own. I think that we live in one of those moments today, and if I imagine what it might have been like to be alive in the spring of 1776 in the United States, that was an exciting time to be alive. I think we live in one of those moments today. Now it's up to us to take the kind of action that the founding fathers of the nation that I'm looking to lead led in the United States. A great uprising, if you will, that is a response to the Great Reset, that merger of state power and corporate power that we reject. But it's not going to be up to us to just, to borrow a biblical analogy, complain about the Pharaoh, but to ask ourselves inside, what is it that makes us want to bend the knee? And once we answer that, we have the path back to our solution. So thank you all for letting me barge into the conference this way. It's actually my pleasure to do it. I've heard great feedback from many of you and friends who are already there participating in the conference, and you can be sure that I'll be joining you all in person at the next available opportunity. Wish you all the best and have a great panel discussion to follow. Thanks again, and we'll talk soon.